All right, everyone. Well, let me welcome you to what I'm going to confess has been my most looked forward to event of the year. And the topic, what art makes of war, perspectives on and from the Ukraine war, is of course highly topical of the moment. But what I love about it is that it links up to an exhibit which we now have running at LSE. If you have not already taken a look at that exhibit, then I hope that after the session today, you will immediately head over. It is in the atrium in the old building and peruse the selection. So it's lovely to be able to have this synchronous event to talk through art, but also to be able to share the art with you. My name is Jackson-Preece. I'm an associate professor here at the LSE with a joint appointment in the European Institute in the International Relations Department. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome also to the LSE today, first of all, Svitlana Biedarieva, I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, who is online. We are in a whiz-bang new building, for those of you who aren't aware, with incredible high-tech features. So we can have Svitlana coming in to join us. And we also, of course, have capacity to be a hybrid event, which we are. So welcome to our online audience. In addition to Svitlana online, we are joined by Rachel and Olha, another one of our artists, along with Svitlana, and my colleague Denisa Kostovicova from the LSE. First things I want to get over with before I forget them are all of the business points. We have a hashtag. We always have a hashtag these days. Our hashtag is LSE Ukraine. Obviously, because this is a hybrid event in particular, be very grateful if you haven't already. If you all put your phones on silent, we want to make sure the acoustics are very good for all of us who are joining us online. Again, as usual at an LSE event, and I think this should be a very interesting part of this event, there will be an opportunity to dialogue with our wonderful panelists. So after we have had the presentations, I will be opening up from Q&A, and we will have Q&A as well from our online audience if there are questions there. Before we actually jump into the substance, let me tell you a little bit about our wonderful speakers. I'm going to start with Denisa because we'll just go over in this direction. Denisa is an associate professor with us at the European Institute, LSE. She is also co-chair of the Conflict, Justice and Peace group. And she is running a very interesting project, which is looking at justice processes. She has engaged extensively with post-conflict situations in terms of justice and reconciliation, and also engaged extensively with art in different ways, both in her own research and also with artists as part of the way in which she conducts research. So Denisa as well takes the credit here for thinking of the event. So we owe her a double thank you. Online, we have Svitlana Biedarieva, who is an art historian, an artist, and curator. As an artist, her work focuses on topics of decolonization, violence, and resistance. This past year, she was selected as the Prince Claus Seed Award laureate for her artistic work, the CEC Arts Link International Fellow for her curatorial work, and the George F. Kennan Fellow at the Wilson Center and the non-resident visiting fellow at the George Washington University for her research. So in other words, we are exceedingly lucky to have her. She is clearly at the cutting edge of what we are going to be discussing. She's the editor of Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives, and the co-editor of At the Front Line, Ukrainian Art from 2013 to 2019. And again, she will be talking about her art to us today. Olha, thank you very much for joining us in person. Olha Pryymak is a painter, currently based at the Royal College of Art here in London. And to keep a clear head from the grief of what's going on in your homeland, and I imagine that must be very poignant, you look to plants. It's always, Olha tells us about the plants, and I gather your family's actually worked land for a long time. And herbalism has been an important practice. You've been using plants as a medium and also as protagonists in narratives in your work. Recent shows include High Official at Scoop, the Saatchi Gallery, Friends and Family showing at the Hong Kong Art Basel OVR, Pi Artworks in 2022, Stand with Ukraine, fundraising show at Hales Gallery in London last year, and Out of Touch, Festival of Intimacy at UCL in 2021. Finally, last but by no means least, I'm joined by Rachel Kerr, who is a professor of war and society just down the road at the other place, at King's. We're great rivals, and we always think a bit about this, LSE and King's. Rachel is a contemporary historian working on transitional and post-conflict justice and memory, as well as international law and war. She co-convenes the War Crimes Research Group at King's and was previously a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center Scholars in DC and a visiting research associate at the Center for International Policy Studies in Ottawa. She is currently also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, as well as the Royal Historical Society. You can see from the depth of my talking how privileged we are to be able to share this conversation with all of our speakers. To begin our conversation and say a few words, Denisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Olha, Svitlana, and Rachel for responding to our invitations, and thank you to all of you for coming. So I'll just make a few introductory points. And I think so quite chuffed to hear that this is one of your favorite events, but it's also an unusual event. You know, why would we have an event about art and creative practice in a place that is a school that studies political science and economics? But I think there are very, very strong reasons, and for all of us who study post-conflict and conflict places, the role of art has become exceedingly important, and I'll maybe hopefully that comes a bit clearer from the points that I will make. So I just want to address three questions, and that is what art does in relation to violence and war, when is it important, and the last questions that I would like to address is why it is important. So I think when a war breaks out and one is confronted with violence, there's some sort of a paradoxical and only seemingly contradictory thing happens, and that is that on the one hand, one has an actual experience of war, first-hand experience of war. It kind of couldn't be more tangible than it is, and yet at the same time, one loses the ability to express the enormity of that violence and the effects of it. So it's a kind of quite a contradictory dynamic. And I think what's quite interesting when one peruses the books that scholars write about transitional justice, that's basically sort of a field of scholarship and practice that looks at how people address and confront atrocity crimes. There is loads and loads of books that sort of have the same thing either in the title or in the subtitle, and that is unspeakable crimes, right? So this kind of, this has become a collocation, the two words that go together. And I always find it's kind of quite poignant because we as academics deal with words, right? And yet that type of sort of horror that one experiences does not easily translate into words. So when we sort of write and sort of try to describe what happens, then people start to bring out through all kinds of synonyms, whether it's horrendous or look at some abominable, appalling crimes, etc., etc. So all of this kind of like vain efforts to try to capture how difficult and impactful and life-changing the experience of war and its effects are. And this is kind of, and I think this is where the art comes in, right? The art cuts through this unspeakable, right? It's a medium that can capture with a glimpse the sort of the deepest sort of atrocities, right? Obviously without words, and yet capturing both the complexity and the emotion. So I thought kind of this is kind of one way in which can we think of where art, kind of what art does to war. It manages to kind of to capture something that the words like human rights violations, even pogroms, ethnic cleansing, cannot capture and cannot kind of touch you as much as an artistic creation. The second point that I wanted to address is when it is important. And here, to think about this question, I would comment it as a scholar both of conflict processes and peace processes. And there is a huge kind of, I would say, fallacy, and I would say also a mistake, if you like, in a lot of writing about peace, because peace is conceived as kind of a moment of rupture and sort of assumes that the war ends. Okay? So there is this idea, that there is war, and then there is the end of war, and then there is peace. And yet there is a kind of a completely different way of thinking about it, and that is in terms of war and peace continuum. Okay? In that, indeed, sort of overtly, right, the violence ends, shooting sort of stops, but a lot of the sort of the consequences not only continue but become even more impactful. It was quite interesting. I've just come back from a meeting in the Balkans where I've talked to participants, and they said that some people with whom, these are practitioners, with whom they work on the ground, are beginning to be affected and beginning to feel the PTSD only 20 years after. It is very common that even 25 years after, 30 years after, this is from some of my other research, women are beginning to talk about wartime sexual violence. So war continues, but in different ways, right? So, for example, those women don't talk about these things because they want to raise families, and time passes, and then the moment comes when they decide that this is the moment. So this is the point that I'm making here, is about this continuum of violence and continuum of trauma. And the art, in that context, has a role throughout this continuum, right? But, and of course, its functions may change, as we know, for example, with the adoption of art in the context of therapeutic interventions in post-conflict places. But the art, that is created at this moment, at the moment during conflict, for example, now in Ukraine, I think it's really important because it becomes evidence, right? It becomes a snapshot of something that was raw, that was real at the time that it happened. And my last point, it is why it is important. I think art is very important, and artifact, and in particular, because the moment the war starts, the politicization starts, right? And war is divisive, not in terms of just dividing the opposing sides. Wars also divide communities on each side. And this is the dynamic that we've been observing in conflicts everywhere, and I think, unfortunately, that will be something that we will observe in Ukraine as well, because wars don't affect people equally, even though the war affects everyone. So therefore, as scholars of transitional justice, we talk about hierarchies of victims, right? So if you look at any sort of post-conflict phase, you see, for example, in Bosnia, you know more about victims of Srebrenica than victims from any other place. And it's really poignant for us who studied other conflicts to see how this kind of, almost this topography of crimes that you know more about, and you know more about some victims than others. So this is just to illustrate this point of polarization. When I talk about polarization, it's not going to be just between the warring sides, but will be also between within the sides, right? In group polarization. what this polarization and politicization does is that it takes away the humanity of the victims. And the victims are basically seen sort of from this kind of polarized perspectives. And this is where the art comes in. Art can sort of remove this fog of polarization and return the humanity to the victims, right? Without kind of sort of really the most effectively removing sort of that layer, through which they're seen or tinted through some sort of political, ideological group membership, or et cetera, kind of glasses. And I'll stop here, but this kind of brings me to sort of a work that we've done in post-conflict spaces with Rachel here and Professor Gao over there, where we looked at what art can then do after conflict to heal the wounds.
Thanks, Denisa. At this point, we are going to be joined by Svitlana online. The magic in this room will work. It's crossed. We've tested it. It did already work. Yeah. Svitlana, maybe you can hear us. Oh, there we are. And we see you now. Welcome, Svitlana.
Hello.
Whenever you are ready.
Okay. Can you see me well? Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So I'm very happy to participate today, and thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted today to talk about my artistic practice. And as an art historian and curator, I much more often analyze other people's works. And so today I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak about my project, artistic project, The Morphology of War, and to discuss the way my art provides one more, perhaps more free than my research activity, reflection on the ongoing war of Russia and Ukraine, and also discuss selected topics of decolonial processes that are ongoing in Ukraine right now in relation to this war. And I will try to to combine my research vision with my artistic interpretation of this topic. So I will share the screen to have the presentation. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, first of all, I would like to start with some theoretical premises that guide my work in general. After the colonial scholar Madina Tlastanova, I distinguish between postcoloniality and decoloniality, not only from a paradigmatic point of view, such as the postcolonial theory that was developed by such Indian theorists in particular as Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak, and the decolonial theory by Latin American scholars such as Walter Mignolo and Anibal Quijano. But also, I distinguish between postcoloniality and decoloniality from a chronological point of view. The postcolonial development in this model that I address in my research immediately follows the resulting downfall of an empire, when a society reworks the recent colonial experience and recombines colonial narratives. The decolonial process, however, is an epistemic project, as the colonial scholars themselves remark. And it takes one step further by liberation from any colonialism-related elements and the creation of new narratives. I use this theory as a cornerstone for my work, mostly theoretical, but also the one that has practical implications for this particular artistic project I'm going to talk about in detail. In my other presentations and texts, I propose that the art in Ukraine recorded how Ukrainian society went from the post-colonial stage after 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and entered into a decolonial stage in February 2022, with the beginning of Russia's attempts at the full-scale invasion of Ukrainian territory. Now, I was very interested to see that there was a recent talk at the LSE European Institute by Gurminder Bambra, who works as well with, it's a very interesting coincidence for me to see. She works with the post-colonial theory and the decolonial theory. And in her 2014 article discussing the connection between both, after Anibal Kikhanov, whom I also mentioned, she proposes that knowledge, in a similar way to property, ought to be considered as a relationship between an individual and something else, and not as an intersubjective relation. According to her, the individuated form of knowledge production has as its correlate the radical absence of the other, which gives way to making the colonial order invisible. And this is something that is very much exercised, this invisibility of the other was very much exercised by the current ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine, and on what Russian propaganda largely relies. The colonial scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos, in his book The Cognitive Empire, also speaks about the absent subjects of knowledge production, when the colonial others are deemed absent because of their weaker voices. This is something that we, Ukrainian scholars, artists, cultural activists, and many others challenge when attempting to put Ukraine under the spotlight, to bring visibility to its culture and agency to its voice, challenging the image of the absent other as an act of resistance to them. This is something that has been continuously subverted by Russian propaganda as a colonialist tool that aims to distort this newly acquired knowledge. The recent wartime works created after the beginning of the full-scale invasion reflected the decolonial processes, both with the documentation of the war atrocities and the radical reactions to military violence. Ukrainian artists, in general, in their majority, produced the key impact on the decoloniality of culture, which is twofold. First, it consists of the dismantling of post-colonial narratives and their substitution with decolonial ones. And second, it presupposes the creation of new content that conceptually breaks with the imperial legacy of Russia. My own work as a part of, as a contribution to this process, experienced a similar metamorphosis, which is reflected both in the visual form of new artistic works that I do and the reinterpretation of the works which were created before 2022. A reinterpretation that opens new perspectives on the war of aggression and the delinked ways of addressing it, even for me, because with the development of this extremely violent situation, I discover new ways of seeing the works from the past. And today I focus on the project which is called The Morphology of War, and it is a reflection on both atrocities and misinformation brought about by Russia's war on Ukraine. In 2017, when the digital graphics series was created, my artist's text for the series reflected on the vision of then hybrid war, which formed after 2014, when the ephemeral hope for the relativity of positions and some kind of impossibility of absolute evil that permits Russia's actions in Ukraine still seemed an acceptable option. This is a quote from the original series description from 2017. The Morphology of War is a project of large-scale digital neural. It focuses on the idea that each society gives birth to its own monsters. In a time of war and under the influence of propaganda, they procreate. Friends change their form and become enemies, unfamiliar, grotesque, and potentially dangerous. They experience severe morphological changes. This project reflects the ugliness of Russian military aggression and the hybrid warfare that distorts the image of the other. It is also an exploration of how deeply destructive instincts are rooted in visual culture, using images from medieval bestiaries and beyond. The continuous line of monsters is reminiscent of the symbolism of the Dance Macabre taken by Ingmar Bergman for the conclusion of his film, The Seventh Seal. This vision, in the quote from 2017, refers to the profound hybridity of the situation, which is reflected in my series as a chimera-like appearance of the participants involved in a deadly dance. Here and further, here and further, I would like to apologize for maybe kind of probably excessive poetic language that I'm not very used to, because I usually work with research, but also part of this presentation is part of the text for a recent exhibition about this project. Returning to the hybridity, in postcolonial theory, hybridity is defined as the often conflictive unity of two narratives, that of a colonizer and that of a colonized. This logic works twofold. As Homi Bhabha defines it, the postcolonial ambivalence is Janus-faced, and it occurs when the oppressor and the oppressed share similar features, and the dominant culture infects its colonial domain with its own cultural identity. This situation is depicted in my work, precisely in the poster of this event, and also it will be exhibited soon in the Atrium Gallery. There is this figure, which is a Janus-faced figure in the center. This duality requires decolonial disentanglement from colonial narratives, and in Ukraine, the main marker of such a turn from post-colonial condition to its colonial situation is the loss of ambivalence with Russia's unequivocal aggression against Ukraine. And this is something that changed precisely in 2022, as I already mentioned. However, in 2017, my series still spoke to this post-colonial entanglement, while the full-scale brutal invasion of Ukraine in 2022 brought about a sharpened, clarified understanding of the uniformity and one-sidedness of the aggression by the Russian army, and the necessity of consolidated resistance to them, highlighting the previously unbelievable or even invisible truth of the unreasonable and uncontrollable evil behind their actions. So in this way, I propose to reverse the logic of the invisibility of colonialism, and to view not the oppressed by the aspiring oppressor as a colonial other, or more correctly, colonial others as a collective figure, who deny themselves the right to knowledge about their own atrocity and experience epistemic disfigurement, not in the last turn because of the extensive work of their own propaganda machine. And I guess now for me is what this project is mostly about. We now know for sure who the monsters are. Everything has changed for me, and the entire Ukrainian society of ambiguity occurred. The hybrid warfare has turned into a sweeping hot war, which dissolved any ambivalence and doubt when the former witnesses of aggression have turned either into its victims or its active agents, their position predominantly defined by the borderline between Ukraine and Russia. In situation of extreme violence, impartiality proved to be impossible, and opposing this war is the only option that may preserve human traits, as the understanding of us being concerned about violence and atrocity. The more Russia fuels the war, the less it is able to see this profound transformation of epistemic disfigurement that is no anymore a media tool, but a way of living. Russia's immersion into the process of falsification of the supposedly existential reasons to keep fighting against Ukraine provokes both appearances and inner nature to change, yet its metamorphosis remains unnoticed by its subjects. As we discussed it with the Estonian curator Tanel Rander, who has recently organized an exhibition Goodbye East, Goodbye Narcissus, and the Estonian Museum of Contemporary Art, where this project also participated. In the case of Russia, the monstrosity has to do with colonial narcissism. I would say Russia, as a former colonial state and an aspiring neo-colonial state as well, sees itself within its imperial past, adoring itself not in its current state, but in the fading reflection of its former colonial glory, elevated to a myth which is created and disseminated by its propaganda. This profound narcissism is inward-looking and therefore blind to any outside perspective. It easily overlooks its self-imposed epistemic violence and doesn't notice that the wild dance of death leads it to the abyss, while the magical hypnotizing mirror of imperialism keeps doing its work. This participation in the dance macabre may be seen differently by its participants. However, the catastrophic end of this grotesque performance of Russia's war, together with the downfall of the narcissistic colonialist revival, is inevitable. a few words about the painting series that I also included into this presentation. My painting series, The Night Has Come, addresses the same distortion imposed by the war from an opposite or like a contrasting perspective. Initially based on collages that I made in 2014 with the outbreak of war and Russia's occupation of Crimea and Donbass, and then expanded to accommodate more images. This series was fully developed in painting in late 2021, early 2022, when the full-scale invasion already seemed imminent. The series examines the ambiguity of the images which conceal fear, displacement, and trauma behind their attractive appearances, using visual references across history of art. The series discusses a variety of topics actualized by the war escalation. It focuses on the implications of colonial striving for the unjust and the cost of participation in the war as an aggressor, where the reward is not worth the loss. It also discusses the embellished reality that frames horrible crimes and suffering caused by the atrocity of the war. The paintings consider the tension between the enemy who pretends to be caring for the victim, such as very popular pretext for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and his real situation of obsession with power. So to conclude, I would like to say that one of the main dangers of Russia's war, beyond its obvious effects of destruction and death that it forces on Ukraine, is that it distorts the images and the narratives. And it is important to resist this process and to recover epistemological justice by further decolonizing our knowledge about Russia's war in Ukraine, producing new disentangled knowledge, and freeing ourselves of post-colonial ambivalence. So this was my attempt to connect my artistic work with my research. I look forward to your questions, suggestions, ideas, and feedback. Thank you very much.
At this point, we turn to Olha, and if you need to use the computer, I think you have some help. Yes, good. So Olha, whenever you are ready. Yes, there we go. It's working, I guess.
Hello, my name is Olha Pryymak. I'm a painter. I'm from Ukraine, but I'm based in London now. And in contrast to previous speakers, I'll try to stick to what I know best, which is not theory, but process. And I'll try to describe the process of the making of these works that you see on the slides. So it started in February, March 2022, and it documents the process of planting from the seed, growing, watering, tending to sunflower plants. The sunflower plants was something of an idea that was born when my parents has recently arrived soon after February 2022 here in London in our home, and we're thinking of things to do for them to keep their mind off of what was going on and how to deal with the changes. And a neighbor suggested, oh, why don't you go plant something? And we did. It ended up in a beautiful sunflower alley along the Regent's Canal, and I tried to document it through this art. I've tried to document that narrative, that story haptically by physically collecting the seeds, collecting the plants, building them into a form of a 3D collage and then painting from them. Painting, because painting is the most persistent form of archival culture making. And it's always, like you suggested, been about the plants. My family did work the land. Mostly the female folk were practicing herbalism. It was for subsistence, survival reasons, for medicine and food. Also, ever since I moved here, moved abroad, the care packages from home would always contain some of this herbal tea, the wild foraged plants. And also, since 2014, the invasion of Donbass and Crimea has made that into a form of a lifeline, a form of a roots, something only tangible that I could hold on to. So I made those plants, the particular herbs that I would receive as my subject matter. They became main protagonists of the paintings. They became the source of learning, and they became the medium in a way that, besides planting these things, I also offered them as tea as they arrived during the exhibitions, and it turned into a performative side of the practice. And basically that constitute conversations over a cup of tea about the cultural connotations of these plants. And what was really interesting is people were focusing on the cultural meaning of the particular plant. And it was something that was beyond just the description of use of recipes, food and medicine, but also it was a prism through which people could look at things, and they could use the plants as a way of the prism to look at life, trying to mark passage of time by using it in particular rituals, like midsummer, for instance, or venerating also the dead, or looking, even conjuring the future in some way. So it all pointed to those cultural traditional uses. And these mechanisms alongside these traditional uses also is a similar kind of mechanism that painting offers. It is a mechanism of coping. Coping with this neck-breaking change we're experiencing, and as we're experiencing history in the making, there are all kinds of threads that are pointing at us. It's easy to talk about them from the privilege of my London studio, being here in complete safety and observing news from afar, but in a way it is really impactful on everyone, not just Ukrainians out here. I would think the dangers of to sense of autonomy, to sense of freedom has been greater as before, and the way we perceive this information, the way we consume and document it and process it is also under threat from new technologies as we speak. And then the third danger would be probably climate change. I mean, only 2 days ago, the destruction of Novokhovka Dam. You think of that as a major ecocide that puts the climate change back up front. And if you think about besides the loss of lives and livelihood to so many people, how many millions of other live things, animals, plants are completely destroyed and devastated. So it's a lot to deal with. And but this panel is one such place to address these things and to deal with them, because just like in Svitlana's example, in 2014, I had my own process of addressing what was happening was the grab of the land in Donbass, and there were all these series of news that were hitting you and trying to work it through. I just painted little paintings. I literally took snapshots from the news and repainted them and then collaged them together with paintings of just daily life. And now looking back at it, it's pretty didactic work. It's just basically looking at things and documenting them. Now I see that was my way of processing that grief and confusion and that attack, not just on land, on autonomy, but on cultural identity per se. I felt like my identity as Ukrainian was under threat during that time. So in 2015, the work, there's one slide that addresses that. The work shown at the Krylov Gallery here in London. And actually we invited journalists and writers, Ukrainian, who did speak about art and violence. It's really nice to link back to that conversation today, because I believe that this witnessing and documenting and making space and place for addressing these changes is just super important. To conclude, perhaps, I'll talk more about the importance of the metaphor for the life affirming, for the resilience that sunflowers became for us as we were growing and documenting and sort of archiving that narrative through painting, but also letting this art to be the placeholder for meaning that other people could inscribe on it and open it up to being that status of agent for change.
Thank you very much, Olha. At this point, I'm going to ask Rachel to come in with her reflections.
Okay, thank you very much. Love to follow that, but I was going to just offer a few sort of more general reflections about the role of art in war, and then consider a bit the role of art in peace as well, in the sort of post-war phase. So picking up some of the things that Denisa's already introduced us to, and hopefully connecting back to what we heard from Svitlana and as well. So I wanted to talk first about the role of art and artists in war, secondly about art in peace, and thirdly, just to reflect a bit on some of the limitations of art, particularly in the context of peace and reconciliation.
Sorry for disturbance. I'm just going to thank you so much.
So as we know, artists have responded powerfully, and we've seen a couple of examples to the war in Ukraine. And in many ways, this is nothing new, because art has always been a powerful means of representing, resisting, and remembering war. What is new is, I think, the sheer volume of work, and particularly the way that it's being disseminated, and I suppose the prolific nature of it, including on social media with accounts like Artists Support Ukraine on Instagram, which has a constant stream of new artworks coming on it, which has an important role, I think, in maintaining, keeping attention on the war and on the work that's being done there, and particularly on the resilience of culture and of art, which I think is an important theme. We've also seen some interventions by artists with more of a global reach, international artists like Banksy, who left a series of murals on damaged buildings in Ukraine in November. And by Peter Howson, I read an interesting interview with him just in the newspaper this weekend about an exhibition that he is opening a retrospective of his work in Edinburgh. He was the official International Imperial War Museum artist in the Bosnian War, and his more recent work is in response to the war in Ukraine too. So these sorts of interventions, I think, raise important questions about the role of the artists in war, and particularly in relation to Howson and what that does, what the involvement as a war artist, if you like, whatever that may be, does to the artist as well. And of the relationship between insiders and outsiders in that space, and then sort of, I suppose, the differences and connections between different artists working in Ukraine and elsewhere, and the connections that they forge. So in terms of the role of art in war, artists have said always played this crucial role in history, throughout history, in documenting the realities of war. And this links back to what Denisa was saying about evidence. And also, I was really struck by your comment about archives, about painting being the oldest archive. I think that's a really insightful, important comment. There's been all sorts of art forms: paintings, photographs, sculptures, literature, other forms of artistic expression to capture the experiences of soldiers, the impact on civilians, and the broader social and cultural context of war. And art can also communicate the personal and emotional impact of war in a way that statistics and news reports can't. So again, what Denisa was saying about the unspeakable, making visible what we think is unspeakable and inexpressible. It can express the pain, suffering, resilience and hope, and the complexities of war, and give a voice to those affected by it, and in some cases create empathy. And as well as depicting what we think of as this glory and horror of war, art, I think, offers a means also to expand our understanding of the nature and character of war by applying a different lens to it, and a way of understanding society's changing attitudes to war. So while it can help us see and understand the consequences and conduct of war, what can it do for peace? What's the role of art in peace? And one reason why the artwork that's exhibited here and elsewhere, artwork from Ukraine is so significant, is that the destruction of Ukrainian culture and cultural heritage has been such a visible part of Russia's war. So in July 2022, UNESCO reported damage to over 164 cultural sites, and I'm sure there are many more since that time, including religious sites, museums, historic buildings, monuments and libraries. And as with so many aspects of this war, it reverberates very strongly with the war in Bosnia, where the image of the destruction of the National Library in Sarajevo and its books and artifacts in August 1992 was arguably one of the more iconic early images from the war. And the story, again, in The Guardian recently, of the struggle to preserve the objects in the collection of the National Museum for the History of Ukraine in Kyiv echoed for me the story of the Historical Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was positioned in Sniper's Alley in Sarajevo during the conflict. The curators there were desperately trying to protect all of the artifacts and artwork within that museum, preserve the history and culture in that way. So while art alone can't change the dynamics or the course of the war in Ukraine, it can and does, I think, play an important role in reinforcing and demonstrating the resilience of Ukrainian culture, and whether or not it can also play a role in building peace after the war and potentially in fostering reconciliation might depends really heavily on its protection, the importance of protecting it and continuing to support its growth. So what are the ways in which art might contribute to these goals? There are ways in which we're more familiar with art, protest art, anti-war art that's been created to protest against a particular war, or has been used to protest against war in general by encouraging us to reflect on its devastating consequences. That's the most famous example is Olha's series of plays and disasters of war, Picasso's Guernica. But art can also play a therapeutic role for individuals and communities that are affected by war. So engaging in creative activities can provide an outlet for emotional expression, can promote healing, and help individuals process trauma. Art therapy programs have been implemented in a number of regions to support the well-being and resilience of survivors, including veterans and civilians. And what's remarkable, again, in Ukraine, I think, is the extent to which this is starting to be implemented while the war is still ongoing, rather than in its aftermath, as is more common. So music therapy programs are being rolled out. And finally, art would be a potentially powerful tool in supporting peace and reconciliation in post-war societies. This ranges from public art installations and exhibitions, commemorate and memorialise, to community projects and participatory workshops. Art's being used as a tool to help foster dialogue, bridge divides and promote empathy and understanding. And it's this sort of indeterminability of art sometimes that allows those dialogues and those conversations to happen within and between different groups. So this has been demonstrated, for example, in Afghanistan with the use of theatre, playback theatre, theatre and music groups in Bosnia to photographic and fine art exhibitions there and elsewhere. But it also has significant limits. While it can have potential significant impact, it also has its limits when we think about its contribution potentially to peace and reconciliation. One is accessibility for artistic expressions. They not always have a broad reach or be accessible to individuals affected by war. Communities might lack resources and infrastructure to engage. and some populations, including those displaced by conflict, may have limited access to artistic interventions. There's also the difficulty of reaching audiences who aren't already kind of on board or not already sympathetic to the goal of reconciliation. So sometimes certainly experiences of the work that we did in Bosnia, the exhibitions attracted audiences, but largely attracting audiences who were already sympathetic to what was being displayed in the exhibitions, rather than trying to shift opinion, attracting people where you could try and shift the opinion. But that really depends on reach. Art can be subjective and open to multiple interpretations too, which is both a strength and a potential weakness when it comes to fostering peace. So different viewers and audiences may have varying responses to the same piece of art, the same artwork, which is influenced by their own personal experiences, their cultural backgrounds, and their perspectives. So art may intentionally or unintentionally reinforce biases or perpetuate certain narratives over others, closing rather than opening up dialogue. But finally, whilst art can raise awareness, it can inspire dialogue and promote empathy, it doesn't have the capacity to directly resolve or end conflict. Nor do artistic expressions alone have the power to bring about political or structural changes necessary for lasting peace. However, in the end, I think, despite its limitations, art can and does play a crucial role in documenting, critiquing, and healing, and in promoting peace in the face of war. And it has the potential to transcend the immediate realities of war, to honour the suffering of those affected by it, and to inspire individuals and societies to strive for peace.
Thank you very much. Well, absolutely fascinating. This is the point where I'm about to give a spiel about how we're going to handle questions and answers to and with our audience. Before we do that, though, I'm going to be cheeky. I'm actually going to ask a question, which is in fact about the role of the audience. It builds on some of the things you've said, Rachel, but I've been thinking about it as I've been listening to both Svitlana and Olha. And obviously, if you kind of think of yourselves as artists, an actor putting forward the communicative act, which is your art, and it gets received by the audience. And clearly the audience, in a sense, determines the meaning of the message, which can shift as audiences shift in exactly the way Rachel has said. One of the things that's, I think, quite striking when we look at audience perception of war, particularly an international audience perception, is how meaning can change. And Denisa, you mentioned Srebrenica. Well, we all know here about Srebrenica, not so much because of the victims, but as a narrative of the failure of the West. I recently saw a headline in an interesting story, and I can't remember whether it was The Guardian, The Economist, probably one of the two, which said something like, Bakhmut is Verdun, which is powerful, isn't it? And it, of course, is taking ownership of Bakhmut by the West. What does it signify? Is it actually about Bakhmut? Or is it instead a kind of mirror of futility of the West, endurance of the West? I mean, read in it what you will. But I would be very interested in hearing from both of you about how you understand your relationship with audience as you are creating your art. What audience do you speak to foremost? And do you have any sense of a kind of uncomfortableness around that different audiences could read your art in different ways, perhaps, than you yourself intended, the kind of power dynamics around it? Anyway, that's my cheeky question. But I now want to open it up to those in the audience. As you do that, I am going to remind our members in the audience, first of all, we have a hybrid audience. So those of you who are online, please feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And please do introduce yourselves online and obviously in our real room here. It'd be lovely to know who you are as well. So I'm opening it up. Questions? Anyone? Yes.
My name is Anne-Christina Runn. I'm a research fellow at the Release Center here at LSE. My question is about this balance, I guess, which might be difficult to strike, in which you, on the one hand, make art that portrays and speaks to these difficult, sometimes even unmentionable traumas and then at the same time ensures that this does not become captured of the forces that are sort of continuing to spur division in society. And there are lots of different examples of artwork, memorial artwork that has become reinterpreted actually as sort of tools to reinforce divides rather than as reconciliatory practices. So I was wondering, inspired by your positive angle on how art can create peace, if you can give some examples of artworks that have managed to address these extremely sensitive and divisive topics, historical traumas, and have managed to actually sort of escape these sort of divisive interpretations and have actually managed to create some reconciliation.
I'll take one more before we go back to the presenters.
My name is Olha. I'm originally from Ukraine. I'm a research fellow in Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. I work as theatre director. I worked with the young people at the war zone since the invasion of Donbass. And coming back to your question, to your remark, I always think about these frames of war and who is speaking on behalf of who. And in terms of framing the war and artistic expression, may be very much more connected to mediatization of this war. I'm concerned at which point war becomes spectacle and the spectatorial kind of side of war. And we kind of witness this. And sometimes when I look at the news, it's like for people, it's like they're watching the action, sort of almost a game in the real time. And the title they produce, General Armageddon, or it's just, sometimes I think it's so kind of take it away from reality. So by saturation with this war imaginary, kind of trying to bring catch lines and titles and attract audience, in the same ways it's take audience so far away from what the war really is. So I'm just struggling always with this concept.
Go back to our artists first, and their thoughts on the question, Svitlana.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm not sure that I heard them all very well, because the sound arrives on Zoom a little bit with echo. But I will try my best to reply. Yes. First of all, I would like to make a general remark that the role of art in reflecting on this war and depicting this war and interpreting this war it proposes two perspectives. First of all, of course, art is important because it reflects on the underlying changes and transformations in the society. And it reflects in a very particular way, because art has this capacity of presenting a very complex ideas in a simple manner and delivering and translating them for wider audiences. This is one aspect. Another aspect, of course, art in Ukraine is a powerful instrument of resistance, per se, is a tool of resilience, is an instrument of change, because by presenting particular questions and statements in the public space, artists manage to receive some kind of response from wider audiences. And in this process of dialogue, of course, some change occurs, and this change we see practically, for example, particularly in the West, kind of as generally speaking, in the Western academia, for example, or in the museum spaces, where Ukraine lately became much more present, and there is more visibility not only to these cultural processes that were fostered or triggered by Russia's war and Ukraine's resistance to it, but also more long-standing Ukrainian cultural legacy that was for years completely omitted from the public view internationally. And this also in part is, of course, the achievement of all Ukrainian artists who talk about the war, who talk about Ukrainian society, Ukrainian culture, and not in the last term, of course, Ukrainian history. So in brief, this is my response.
Great. So perhaps I have 2 points to respond to your question specifically, and it's an important one. The first one is the point on ambivalence, the one that Svitlana brought up. And ambivalence is, I'm not ashamed to say, it's something that I was carrying in myself because I was growing up through the Soviet period of education. And it's only later with learning and really diving deep into history, trying to figure out how people responded to their changing, shifting environments, specifically Ukrainians in 1920s and 1930s, the influence of famine, of collectivization and war. There are lessons to be learned, and it's important to hold on to these lessons. But that ambivalence actually is something that was fictitious, and it's something to be shaken off once you expand your vision of what history is. Ambivalence in art is something that was that was current, perhaps, or perhaps in some circles still is. I totally dropped that inhibition. I am not ambivalent about how I want my art to be perceived. I want to communicate very clearly and specifically, because I do have an urgency. I feel it's a social responsibility in a way that I want to reach out people in a certain way to bring to their attention to certain subjects that I feel strongly about, which is yeah, so it's basically greater than myself at this point, and I'm just hopefully contributing. Now, to respond to your question, how do you reach out to the audience? Now, because besides painting practice, because I also have a social side, social engagement side of my practice, and I work with moving bodies, I understand the difficulties of how connecting with communities and know the delicacies of it. And I realize that it is really hard work. And it's a very slow building up process, and I just hope that with trying something and seeing it works, and then reiterating and making it better, we'll create a platform, we'll create a holding space for perhaps a community to come together and perhaps to, in a small way, contribute to, you know, that tipping point. You know, if there enough conversations being held about a particular subject, what are they saying, about 25%? It's all it takes, 25% of population to agree on that subject for it to become social change. So every event, every participation, every person who engages with work could be that contribution to that tipping point. Yes, so at the moment you see a lot of art that is witnessing and it's documenting, and it's very, very important as well to have that work done for people who are doing it, but also for people who are experiencing it, because it's a way to talk about things, to bring them out, to work through trauma, so to speak, and to build up on that collective narrative, to try to react against, perhaps, if someone doesn't like the message. But it's a cultural landscape that we're building collectively towards some positive change.
Thank you. Rachel. Yeah, I mean, I was sort of struck by your question to Olga, this question of who is the art for? I'll ask you that. That's what, who are you making it for? Who are you? This question of audience, which relates back to your question, reconciliation. And it's really difficult. It's hard to point to an artwork that has created. That and what you think reconciliation is or should be. I mean, there's certainly artwork. There's artwork that represents the sort of representation of reconciliation. So think about the statue, I guess the reconciliation statue outside the cathedral in Coventry is supposed to be a symbol of reconciliation, but only appeared to after years have gone by and that reconciliation seems to be there. Some of the, I mean, it depends. Point of the, I suppose the point of the artwork sometimes is to open up dialogue and create empathy and create understanding, and have a dialogue and not tell necessarily, or tell one story but get people to engage with it and come with their stories. So there's a series of murals in Derry in Northern Ireland, and the artists that created those talk about them being reconciliatory and talk about them as part of their aim was to foster reconciliation through them, to represent the experience of the community, and therefore sort of try and encourage the other side to come with their experiences. And so their sort of I suppose slogan across it is we'll tell you our stories, you come and tell us yours. But of course that requires people to come and want to come and tell the stories, and so you've got to be somewhere down the road and have that, have that desire to engage. I don't think I could give you an example of where an artwork's just changed somebody who has a really polarized opinion or something, but perhaps sort of chipping away. But it's creating those spaces for those interactions to happen, whether it's in the space of having an art installation and some people engage with that, or in kind of participatory workshops, which is another one that people use. And then it's not the art that's necessarily important, it's the creative practice, and all being in a room together.
Okay, so I'll address your question, because my way of studying peace is actually to study war first, to understand what happens. And there are many research programs that look at the changing nature of war, and it's a really sort of an important sort of task to see actually what has changed about war. And in some ways, everything has changed, and in some ways, nothing has changed. So, for example, I mean, when you talk about this when you talk about imagery, my first thought was almost that there is kind of like the gamification of war. You know, for example, if you look how new technologies change the way the wars are fought, and if you look at the reports, I mean, I'm really almost surprised, you know, when I see documentaries, soldiers going into the trenches, which are most sort of reminiscent of the First World War, right? Of the sort of what America would call an old war, and you have soldiers there sitting with their iPads, right? Drones. The way drones have been used, and all of the swarms of drones, and sort of the role of the technology. So that has kind of profoundly changed, and scholars are kind of catching up on this. There's really interesting discussions, for example, about the ethics of war. And so, for example, somebody sitting in a third country and operating a drone. This is beyond Ukraine's context, but has an effect elsewhere. So there's lots of aspects of it, right? And also in terms of what it does, in terms of what we call micro dynamics of war, right? What it does on the ground. So that is kind of this part and parcel continuous change of war on the one hand, and on the other hand, if we look at the technology, the way we perceive war, you know. So it is kind of quite, I remember, you know, when we had the, let's say, 30 years ago, the Balkan conflict and sort of 24 news cycles, you know, so in the context of globalization, right, all these discussions that shrink space, does away with the distance. People live at distance and experience violence at a distance. So already this 24 news cycle completely changed the way people are exposed. And if you look at now, you know, through Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, I mean, you can see these images, you know, all the time, right? And also, in a way, sort of you have that, again, contradictory dynamics that, you know, yes, you're exposed to it, but maybe less sensitive, less. But I think, so that is kind of something that has so profoundly changed. But ultimately, nothing has changed, you know, when you see, when you see what the effects of, you know, however, sort of the war has changed, sort of in the way sport has changed, people's suffering is exactly the same, you know. You have, you know, either people lose loved ones or they themselves, you know, survivors either of violence, torture, you know, that kind of profoundly hasn't changed at all, you know. And so basically, where are we then with that? You know, I think ultimately, again, we come back to this question of empathy and understanding and sort of taking the perspective, sort of, you know, of the other, right? Understanding how they suffer. I was quite sort of it was quite poignant, and Rachel and I've written about this, how women from Bosnia have instantly responded to the first reports of rape in Ukraine. You know, so to these transnational solidarities that were created. And if there is anything positive, you know, about the, you know, whole thing was that they actually immediately reached out to share their experiences, you know, what they need to do either to get justice or to better cope, you know, in their environments with what's happened. I don't know whether that answers, but I think that would be my response, and probably the place that creative practice would come is that really, you know, you need to come back to, you know, those victims, you know, they need to regain their humanity. They need to be recognized, you know, for just human beings who suffered, and you know, and then that opens up the whole question of justice and recognition.
We have time for some more questions.
I'm a former visiting fellow at the European Institute. It was a great privilege to hear the two artists talking about the creative process. I was just by chance, I was at Tate Britain yesterday, where there's a small exhibition on war at the time of the French Revolution and just after. And of course, a striking thing there, and it's obviously something we're so immersed in the present, can't think about it now. But of course, there's always different messages coming out about the war. And what was very striking in this Tate exhibition was Turner and others applauding, you know, the hopes and the victory, they hoped a victory for anarchy. And yet there was also a huge painting, the biggest painting in the room, was celebrating the death of a military hero, which was, of course, the government's point of view. And I just wondered if you had any reflections about that. Perhaps that's more of a question for the art historians, but I repeat, it was really a great privilege to hear you and Svitlana.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria. I'm a student at King's College London, Strategic Communications. Question would be about the Well, recognizing the reconciliation effect of art, there were a lot of efforts of gathering under one roof Ukrainian and Russian artists, especially those efforts coming from the West mostly. And well, to my view, they were not really productive and not really, and I suspect it might be more traumatic for both sides at this point. Like, could you maybe outline when would be the time when it would be appropriate to kind of, if ever, create those spaces? Thank you.
Yes. I wanted to ask about the role of photojournalism and if you ever thought of that, because I can think of certain very iconic images in the history of photojournalism that I would argue have helped to change the tide of public opinion. And it also, in terms of their accessibility as well, obviously, has the power to go to a wider audience. Anybody else? Sorry, I couldn't quite see you back there. Yes.
Not often you can't see me.
I think it's just the angle at which I'm sitting in my lack of stature.
Straight line, I know. I'm James Gow. I have a question for Svitlana, and forgive me if you think this was already addressed, but I noticed that your work had been retitled, and I would really like a big expansion and commentary on that renaming of the work, if I've understood that correctly. Very interesting. It has one meaning, it has another meaning.
Thank you very much. Well, shall we go to Svitlana again?
Yes, so thank you for the questions. I'm afraid again I heard the questions just partly, but I will try to respond. First, I would like to address the question about reconciliation and how actually art reflects these processes. And I must say that art in Ukraine has its logic of development since 2014, which reflects very it reflects very closely all the changes that transformations that Ukrainian society goes through. And for example, we can think about the year 2014 as the year that began this movements towards documenting the war, and it was some particular type of documenting when many artists who needed to be displaced, for example, from those occupied territories, they returned them to these zones nearing the war zone, and they recorded different aspects of this war, and then they delivered it to audiences that were outside of this zones. So in a way, artists were conduits of this ongoing traumatic events. And at the same time, there was this turn to archival materials and the turn to interpretation of contested history through this turn. And then this all changed in 2022, and there was a full-scale invasion, and most of the territory of Ukraine was immersed into this situation of the war. And in this way, artists turned already to personal chronicles, and the way of this was not to deliver this kind of reports from the front line, but already to reflect and connect to the audiences' personal experiences that they could see around themselves, all these shellings and all these atrocities that they could witness. And then there was another change in the second half of 2022 after Ukrainian society discovered more about all the mass graves, all the killings in Bucha, in many other places, and they discovered more about Mariupol. And this kind of, there was this reflection, which was more bodily oriented reflection on human agency in general, on the agency of Ukrainian citizens, and in the face of this atrocity and so on. And this was already not a documentation process, that was the process of interpretation. And so there are many stages that are ongoing now in relation of how art addresses war in Ukraine. I must say that in my case, and I think also in Olha's case, there is this certain discrepancy from this underlying logic, because we create our art from outside of Ukraine. So in a way, it's from the beginning an artistic reflection rather than a possibility of a chronicle or a possibility of documentation. And I think this is what is important in case when we speak about this projects focusing on the war in Ukraine that are created inside Ukraine, and the projects that are created outside Ukraine. And turning to the question when there will be this possibility that art addresses the possibility of reconciliation, for example, as it reflects the underlying logic of that Ukrainian society follows and the processes. Of course, it's the main problem here is that the war is ongoing and the deaths are occurring. So not until the war is finished, not until Russia withdraws its army from the territory of Ukraine, art can do anything in order to do this kind of steps, because art also reflects on the situation in which we are now. And the situation is now that there is a necessity of active anti-colonial resistance. And this what Ukrainian art, both created inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine, works with predominantly at this moment. As for the renaming of my work, thank you for noticing. I think it also reflects on particular logic of this work, because in 2014, when I created first a series of collages, it was called Aftermath, because I started throughout the year, I started kind of thinking about this war as something more temporal, and this kind of outburst of violence as a one-time outburst of this conflict, of this war, not the conflict, but the war of Russia and the occupation. But I felt that there is time that this most difficult moment passed, and it's time to think about the aftermath of it, how it distorts, how the war distorts this images, and the war distorts narratives and so on. But in 2021, at the end of the year, it became already started becoming obvious that it's not the end. So that's when the series was renamed, because the main difficult part was just about to start, and that's why the series received new name. That the night has actually arrived after 9 years of all this process that seemed a final process, but in reality was just preparation for this violence that we witness now. Thank you.
I'm so pleased you heard that, because I think there were several people in the room that had also noticed the change in title. So it was a question, I think, that many here were really interested to hear your thoughts on. At this point, again, return to Olha.
All right. To add to, I would say I would get this question more than once. Would you be willing to collaborate with an artist that's from Russia? Yes, besides the point that this has to be, besides the point I suppose not until the total justice will be brought on everyone who's committed these crimes, which is, is out there for people who are specializing in politics, how achievable this is. On my own personal terms, if I were to speak to a imaginary Russian artist out there, as a Ukrainian, I would really love you to start moving past this narrative. Oh, I am also victim in this, and I really can't do anything about this situation. Just how about next step? I would love to hear something in the lines of decolonizing your own imperial history, decolonizing the work of learning about what really went down and how it shaped your culture, and what can you do to try to unpack it and contribute to this positive change from your position.
Thank you. I don't know which question. Final reflections, I think, at the end. The question about photojournalism is an interesting one. It's lots of exhibitions, lots of big, even the one here has photographs, which are a form of artwork. Artistic expression. So it does, but is photojournalism something different from that? Does it then become artwork when it's displayed in an exhibition afterwards? I mean, we worked with the continuation to do it with photojournalists whose images from Bosnian War have subsequently been displayed as in the exhibitions and been important. And I think it comes back to, I'd say it comes back to this question of evidence and archives, and it's a piece of evidence, just as it is forms of art in helping us to understand what happened and understand the experiences of different groups of people. But it's perhaps slightly different from art, and I'm not an art historian, so I don't know how it's sort of seen in those terms, but it strikes me as something different, certainly from the kind of practice that we engage in, of creating an artwork, having that sort of personal process of creating something that is interpreting the world in a particular way, as opposed to a photograph which captures a particular moment in time. That's your question as well. I thought it was really interesting.
At that point, I've seen you ask the question, I immediately thought, Svitlana, I hope you could hear this. In one of your pieces of work, you had Napalm Girl, the very famous photojournalist representation of Vietnam, in your butterfly. I mean, that was a really fascinating crossover, I think, between what begins as photojournalism and then now, of course, you are embodying it within your own art in your own way. So maybe in the end, we can't really clearly distinguish between the two.
Okay, so I'll just take up your question because I think it's very important. And it basically, the way what you've described sort of very neatly points to a very problematic practice that is sort of pursued and implemented in post-conflict societies everywhere, where I wouldn't say with bad intentions, right? But it kind of turns out like that, where lots of funding goes into projects that would bring persons from two opposed sides and sort of try to kind of artificially somehow create or recreate some sort of multiculturalism and bring peace, So I think this kind of, and there is a huge risk there, because it is very interesting the way we are seeing the shifts in the programming in the sort of international community, that they, in terms of projects that they fund, that they're beginning to recognize the potential role of artistic sort of practice. So whether it's music or visual or whatever, but to fund them they can be funded in different ways, right? These projects, but the wrong ways are such to bring some people sort of artificially together and then sort of think this is how you create peace and heal communities. We spoke about Romeo and Julietism, yes. So basically, you have projects that are, funding Romeos and Juliets in all different kinds of incarnations of different conflicts that you have throughout the world. So that would be kind of a bit of a bleak perspective on kind of how, the potential benefits are lost. But on the question of reconciliation, I would say that the views of the conflict, and towards a conflict, and especially if you look from a side that is committing violence, or the things are never so monolithic. So, for example, at the height of the Milosevic regime and the war, you had artists who opposed violence very openly, right? And for which they paid the price in their own society. They were ostracized, thought as traitors, etc. And if you look at Russian communities, there are examples, but there is no spotlight on them, where artists are opposing Russia's war at their own peril, right? For being and for us now, for example, what's happening in Serbia at the moment, those artists, those new emigres, have actually linked up with the artists who opposed Milosevic's regime to try to learn more from their what they called activism, artistic activism. So I think these practices, they're small and marginal, but I think they're important in that they exist, and they maybe provide the seeds or examples or way to go. And maybe these are the beginnings, even while the war is ongoing, that, maybe, will provide one day an important legacy in art, right? That, make it bring about some processes of critical reflection in terms of Russia's role in the conflict.
Well, what a fantastically interesting conversation this has been. We'll have one more. We're over time. One more question, because I'm enjoying the conversation so much. I think
no question, but thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to say T. Kim Fook to give individuality to the symbol Napalm Girl.
At this point, I want to thank all of our speakers, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody in the audience, whether they're online or in this room with me. It has been a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to engage with you in this conversation. Special thanks to Svitlana, who's born with the technology online, and to both of you and to Olha for joining us. Being able to listen to you as artists and hear your own reflections as practitioners who are engaged so deeply in this moment has been some thought-provoking, but really inspirational. I hope we have more events of this kind. Obviously, thank you to Denisa for having the idea, and to Rachel for joining us. And remember, everyone, we actually have an exhibit as well here at LSE, and I do hope you will pop into the old building, to the atrium, and take a look at that. Thank you, everyone, very, very much.
Can I just say on that exhibit, just a couple of words, that because I helped organize it, and there was a question of photography.
Yes.
And it's really a very beautiful exhibit. I went to inspect it, and what really moved me so powerfully was that I was familiar with the photography part of it, because I was working with a Ukrainian colleague who helped put the photographs together. I saw them online. I wasn't familiar with the image of the sunflower, the painting. And when I walked into that room and saw that amazing painting, it is so beautiful, and it so complements the photography in the sense of it speaks to you at so many different levels. And that was before that dam broke, by the way. Now we also see ecocide in that image, but it speaks to nostalgia, pain, suffering, blood, so many different levels. One of the most powerful works of art I have seen. I really urge everybody to go and have a look at that exhibition.
I will just say, maybe
Thank you
from
for
tomorrow
sharing.
when Svitlana's piece is there, and this is Professor Tomila Lankina, and the exhibition is joined, I mean, it's there written, but it's a joint effort between the European Institute and the Department of International Relations. It was kind of a lovely also collaboration within the LSE, and
And we have some events on Ukraine on the
Yes.
17th of June, next Saturday, as part of the LSE Festival of Ideas. Do register and do come and support this event. Thank you very much, everyone.